So I've just finished The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve by Stephen Greenblatt. Um, and I read this book over the course of several months, so it's all going to be a little bit hazy in my head. Stephen Greenblatt is an interesting figure to me because I was looking for a book on Adam and Eve, and I recognized his name as a literary scholar. And so I chose this book above the other ones just because basically on name recognition. And each of the chapters, or sometimes clusters of chapters, is its own separate, basically, essay about the story of Adam and Eve. And he wants to catalog, he wants to go through the story of Adam and Eve in a historical way. And I don't mean that he like views it as a history. It's actually kind of the opposite. He wants to view how the story has changed over time and how it has been interpreted by different figures. So, first of all, he starts with the story, and I think it's a really interesting um, place to start because people, I mean, as with a lot of stuff in the Bible, people really think that people have a clear idea in their head of what the story of Adam and Eve says and what it's about. But of course, that concept in their head contains a lot of extra stuff that is just sort of there. Like it's not from the story. Like for example, the serpent in the story, right? Everybody's like, oh, that's Satan, um, and that is. I'm tempted to call it like paratext, because it's not in the text. It's simply not there. But it is such a strong and prevalent tradition of interpretation that it's, sort of present anyway. You know what I mean? Like if you're talking about the story of Adam and Eve, that is an interpretation that is so common, that is so well known, that is so reflexive for many people that just because it's not in the text doesn't mean that you don't have to talk about it. And there's a lot of stuff like that. There's some less well known things. I remember in college I took a Bible as literature class where we talked about Lilith. Lilith is interesting. She is a product of two factors coming together. The first factor being the like way that the Bible was put together, and the second factor being extremely horny medieval monks. So I'll talk about both of those factors. The way the Bible was put together. So the book of Genesis, scholars have known for a really long time, or at least the opening account, is from two origin stories that were stitched together. So two separate origin stories that needed to be fused together. And the reason that we know that is because it's actually really clear that certain things get repeated, certain things get elided and sort of, mentioned but then not added upon in a way that would not happen if this were a single unitary story that someone had come up with. So, for example, there's two creations. God creates, everything in the world, and then separately, again, He creates, more stuff, people basically. Um, and so the fact that there are a couple of things that God seems to create twice, women being one of them, um, led extremely horny medieval monks to postulate that actually what happened is it's not that this story is inconsistent. It's not that this is a literary text that was stitched together. Um, it's that the Bible means exactly what the Bible says, and God did actually create a man and a woman, but that woman wasn't Eve because it says later that He creates Eve. So they had to postulate a third person. They had to postulate a second woman. And so the question is, what happened to her? What's up? What's her deal? And so from there, they just let their imaginations run wild. And you've gotta think that these are guys who are down bad. They're down extremely bad. And so what they came up with was crazy. What they came up with was basically just the horny ramblings of a lunatic. Um, and it's a great story. It's a great bit of like tradition, like Christian tradition. Um, anyway, I won't belabor the point there. Maybe we'll talk about Lilith another time. So Stephen Greenblatt, and the book that I actually read, he goes through varying interpretations of the Adam and Eve story, and he talks about, first of all, the first thing that I find really interesting is the way in which the Adam and Eve story is used as a justification for the subjugation of women. I think that this is probably the most interesting thread to pull on in terms of the history of this story, because, if you look at the story itself on its own terms, um, without any of this Christian tradition clouding your perception, um, it's pretty clear that both of the humans suck and are at fault. But if you have to elevate one of them to be sort of worse off, it's absolutely not Eve. It's definitely Adam. The way that the story presents these things is essentially that Adam is made first, Eve is made second. Adam teaches her the things that he thinks she is supposed to know, and he teaches her incorrectly in a way that makes her susceptible to deception from the serpent. The serpent deceives her. She gets Adam to transgress along with her, and he agrees. And then, as soon as it becomes obvious that they are going to be punished for this, Adam blames the whole thing on her. So in that story, who's really the piece of shit here? The person who got a faulty set of instructions and then was deceived, or the person who gave a faulty set of instructions and then blamed his own problems on his wife? If you just read the story, it really does not make either of them look really great, but clearly Adam is sort of more at fault here. However, the way that the story has been interpreted is that Eve, and in this case, Eve is seen to this is the one time that evangelicals have reading comprehension skills and view things metaphorically, is when they're trying to take a bit of the Bible and use it to explain why patriarchy is good or something. They're like, yeah, this is the one time that a person in the Bible can be a metaphor, and that's Eve standing in for all women in general. Generally, evangelicals don't allow for metaphorical readings. That's called heresy. But in this case, the transgression of Eve is somehow viewed as representing, all of women. Women's essential nature is represented by this thing that Eve did, which, to be clear, in the original, is get tricked by this weird talking snake thing, because her husband is a dope who didn't explain things to her properly. And what else? Oh, yeah. So the thing that's really interesting here is the way in which this story, which on its own merits, seems to, if anything, present the man as having the greater portion of fault for the fall of mankind. How this story is then twisted into a justification for patriarchy. People essentially say, well, the problem with this story is that Adam, for even a single moment, listened to a woman. That's the main issue right there. If it hadn't been for Adam's moment of, listening to a woman, then, we would all still be eating fruit in the Garden of Eden. Which is fucking crazy, but I guess if you're looking for a justification of patriarchy, you'll pretty much do whatever you can. Okay, so that's the funny one. It's the funny one, and then from there, I think that there's a couple of other. Like I said, this book is organized into sort of essays, basically. And the next essay that I want to talk about is he talks about Thomas Aquinas. I think it's Thomas Aquinas. It might have been some other guy. I don't remember. One of the early church fathers. I think Thomas Aquinas. And he talks about this guy's life and how it's his theology is sort of tied in with the story of Adam and Eve, and how his approach to interpreting the Bible became very, very influential in the way that Christians interpret the Bible. And he doesn't quite say it, but the conclusion I'm drawn to, and I'm inclined to think this is the conclusion that Stephen Greenblatt wants me to be drawn to, the conclusion I'm drawn to is that, man, Thomas Aquinas was a dumb nerd, and he sort of ruined this for everybody. Because what Thomas Aquinas did was he took the story of the Hebrew Bible, and in general, he took Christianity as a whole, and he sort of tried to make it make sense within the category of like Greek philosophy, basically Greek and Roman philosophy. And he did this for some personal reasons. So Thomas Aquinas started out as a learned guy in the Greek and Roman tradition of philosophy, and he was sort of resistant. Like, he didn't want to be a Christian. His mother was a Christian. His father wasn't. And he, when he did become a Christian, he was sort of drawn to this sort of idea of hidden complexity. Because as a kid, or as a youth, it had seemed that, Greek philosophy, that's where the real intellectual depth is. Whereas this sort of Hebrew mythology shit, that's like dumb baby stories for babies. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to take the philosophy of his youth and show how the religious stories that he now believed in, were actually a sort of like deep commentary on these philosophical topics, which I don't think is necessarily like a horrible project to sort of synthesize a philosophical tradition with a religious tradition. I just wish that it hadn't become like what Christianity is. Because here's the thing, if this was some side project that was like, oh wow, yeah, you really can synthesize Christianity with Western philosophy, isn't that neat? And it's like a side thing that people think about, that would be one thing. But this guy was so influential that this has become what Christianity is. If you question some of the underlying like assumptions that he had or conclusions that he had, some people will just tell you like, you're not a Christian. And it's not stuff that's like in the Bible or even implied by the Bible. It's stuff that he like made up. And made up is a strong word. He like philosophized it up. But it's just some stuff some guy said. So for example, like the Trinity, right? The Trinity is one of these concepts that comes from trying really hard to synthesize to synthesize the mythology of Christianity with like rigorous philosophical categories. It's essentially an issue that arises when you consider the fact that the Bible says some stuff that just doesn't make any sense. And what it says is that Jesus. Well, it's not that the Bible says this. It's that the Bible and Christian tradition come together to say these two things that are mutually contradictory, which is that Jesus is God and that Jesus is the Son of God. And those don't make any sense together. They can't. They don't add up. So basically, what you need to do is you need to come up with this philosophical loophole that lets you pretend that makes sense. And to be clear, I'm not really against the Trinity or anything. Like, I think it's an interesting and cool doctrine to say, like, yeah, actually, it turns out the divine doesn't work in ways. It works in ways that transcend human categories. Like, whatever, that's cool. But the thing that I'm pointing to is that what we're talking about, and this is like a big selling point for some brands of Christianity. Like, if you're not on board with the Trinity, you probably like can't be a Catholic. On paper, you can't be a Catholic. On paper, I don't think you can be Orthodox either. I'm sure there's some Protestants who would kick you out too. But what I'm pointing at is that this idea that some churches are like very, very attached to, and like you can't be a part of our thing unless you agree with this. It doesn't come from Christianity. It doesn't even come from church tradition. It comes from trying to synthesize those things with Western philosophy. And at the end of the day, like the religion of Christianity is not about these philosophical categories. And this is all for something that I like, by the way. Like, I like the Trinity, and there are similar problems for philosophical concepts in Christianity that I just don't like. Um, for example, Stephen Greenblatt points to this as the beginning of a different reading of Christianity. So I might be muddling things up here a little bit because I did read this book over several months. But in the narrative of changing interpretations of Christianity, he talks about how as the world became more modern, this question arose of, should we view these stories mythologically, or should we view these stories literally? And that issue arose over time, and the first people who were grappling with that issue wouldn't necessarily have put it in those terms. Like, for example, Thomas Aquinas would not have said, I don't think he would have viewed, I mean, I don't know. I haven't been able to talk to the guy, Thomas Aquinas. He doesn't really pick up my calls, so maybe I shouldn't be saying what he would have said. But I think people at the time, the earliest people who were grappling with this question, wouldn't have thought of it in terms of mythology versus literal truth. They just would have thought of it in terms of like, well, how much wiggle room is there in these stories? But by the time you get to the Enlightenment, you have a big problem. And this problem is set in place by Aquinas, because he puts Christianity on a track towards this sort of literalism. He says, no, these stories, actually happened. They're like directly true, and the truest truth in them is the literal truth. So it's complicated because sometimes Christians and atheists alike will hear you say that, like, oh, well, these stories are metaphorical, they're mythological, whatever, and what they think you mean by that is that they're not true. And I think it's important to distinguish that there is a truth that is more important than the literal truth. A story can tell the truth without being something that if you were there at the time, you would have been able to see with your own eyes, or you would have been able to record with a video camera. And I think this idea is pretty present in the Christian tradition. I mean, in the Gospels, whenever anybody asks Jesus a question, it seems like he always just tells them a random story. So, and he doesn't do that, I mean, some exceptions, but he doesn't generally do that to confuse them or to be like, well, I can't tell you what I actually think, so I'll tell you the story. He seems to do that because he believes that by telling a story, we can access a truth that is truer than if we just, went directly for the question, if we just directly answered a direct question. And I think we can read and Stephen Greenblatt agrees, this is sort of the thesis of the book, I think that we can read the story of Genesis in the same way. And Thomas Aquinas hates that shit. To him, that's like saying, well, this is just like a little kiddo bedtime story. This is just a little bedtime story for idiots. And so for him, the story must be literal, or it's nothing. It's either exactly true, or it's a lie. And during the medieval era, this isn't that much of a problem because it's easy for people to just say, well, yeah, of course, like, it's true. And okay, this is a whole can of worms, but I think people's concept of mythology is a little bit distorted here. Because I think what most people would say, what most people would think in response to what I just said is, well, isn't that always how people have viewed their mythology? If you asked an ancient Greek, does he really live on the top of Olympus? They would have said yes. But I don't really think that is an accurate way of thinking about things. Because, sure, I think the ancient Greeks would have mostly answered yes to that question if posed to them directly. But I also think that if you really grilled them on, like, well, does your system necessitate that these things be literally true? If I could take you to the top of Mount Olympus, the actual mountain, and show you that there's nothing there, would that destroy your worldview? I think what they would say is no. The literal presence of like a palace on the top of Mount Olympus is not the cornerstone of the worldview that we have a fragment of in the form of Greek mythology. It's really more that these stories represent a relationship between the human and the divine, and a relationship between the divine and itself. It explains the transcendental elements in the world in a way that can be understood by anyone. And I think that's how people have mostly understood their own mythological and religious beliefs until relatively recently. Like, I think the idea that it's not just that these things are literally true, but that their literal truth is the whole point, that the literal truth is a make or break facet that I think changes things for people. Like, well, one way of thinking about this is that is fundamentalism is a thoroughly like modern concept. You don't really have like medieval fundamentalists, because it's just a like universe in which those concepts and the questions that even lead to fundamentalism don't exist. And that's not just that, like, well, everyone was a fundamentalist, so nobody was. It's not. I don't think it's really that simple at all. It's more so that the worldview is total, and I think most people would say, like, yes, of course, our religion is like literally correct, but also that even if it isn't, that doesn't really like undo a lot for people, you know? Okay, so I completely forget. Oh, yeah. So the reason that this tangent is so important is because Thomas Aquinas sets us on a road, takes us off that track where what's important is the mythological, like abstract ideas, and he puts us on a track where it's like, no, these stories are literally true, and that they are literally true is what makes them an effective part, what makes them valid as a part of our worldview. And that concept is eventually going to collide with the Enlightenment. And the problem with the Enlightenment is that once you start demonstrating, so at first, when Thomas Aquinas makes this shift that like the literal, actual, direct truth of these stories is what makes them valid, that's a very subtle shift at the time that he's making it, right? Because of course everybody believes these stories, and saying the fact that they literally happened is what makes it like makes them have any validity at all. That's a very subtle shift because everybody already agrees that they really did happen. But that subtle shift becomes not so subtle once you get down to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, where people are starting to question the validity of these stories, the literal truth of them, and they're starting to question them using the tools of science that can demonstrate that some of the basic ideas in this story do not hold up to scrutiny. So, for example, there's the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, which is a thing that my middle school geology teacher believed. My earth science teacher believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and he would sometimes teach us about it in earth science. That was really cool. Anyway, so there are these ideas that come from the Bible, such as the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I feel like I need to explain that one. The way that it works is that if you count up, basically some dude in like, I think the Renaissance or something, counted up all of the days, like all of the time passing that is mentioned in the Bible, and then he worked backwards from the present date to figure out how much time had passed since the earliest events in the Bible, and it was about 6,000 years old. It was about 6,000 years, so he concluded that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and that was a biblical truth. But the problem is, once you demonstrate that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, because we've been moved onto this track where the validity of these beliefs is premised on their literal truth, we're screwed. Once you've bought into the idea that if some of these things are not literally true, that means we have to throw the whole belief system out the window. And then the Enlightenment starts demonstrating that, well, no, this isn't true. Well, this thing isn't true either. Then you're in really, really serious trouble. And this leads us to our third essay that Stephen Greenblatt talks about, which is this guy from the Renaissance whose name I have completely forgotten. Maybe I should make some notes before I make these videos. I don't know. And this guy, oh, actually, no, No. Then the next thing we have to talk about is Milton in Paradise Lost, because Milton in Paradise Lost is interesting. I'm not sure how much I'm going to have to say about this because it's less like history of Christianity and more like just an interesting work of literature. Um, but actually, it is. Well, I mean, one thing that's really interesting is that so Thomas Aquinas takes these concepts that add philosophical rigor to the story. And during the Renaissance, Milton wants to do something kind of similar, but he wants to add psychological and storytelling rigor to the story of the fall of man. And he more or less achieves this. Like he writes a poem that adds psychological depth to Adam and Eve in a way that makes it so that they're a believable couple. In other words, he fills in a whole lot of the blank space in the story, and he adds in a whole bunch of stuff about the war in heaven that leads to the fall of leads to the fallen angels. And what I find really interesting about this is that actually a lot of the stuff that Christians think comes from their religion actually like comes from Paradise Lost. And I mean that's not such a bad thing. It's nice to have a dialogue with literature, but it's just weird. I don't know how to say it. It's weird. Um, like I don't know. Imagine if there were a writer today, a contemporary, who wrote a work of fiction that was based on the Bible, and then Christians were just like, yeah, no, that's true. We're adding that to the church tradition. It's just it's weird. Um, okay, that's what I have to say about Milton. Also this book convinced me that I maybe need to think about reading Paradise Lost because it sounds very interesting. It unfortunately also sounds very hard. Okay, anyway, the next thing is the Renaissance, which and Renaissance theology, because this leads us to a situation in which during the Enlightenment, Christianity and Christian theology essentially implodes because so much has been staked on the literal veracity of some of these stories um, that it puts believers, not skeptics, not atheists, not even people who are against Christianity, but full believers, people who pray every day, all that stuff, who are also inquisitive and want to understand these things more deeply. It puts them in a situation where they're essentially being forced, like just thinking about the story while also knowing anything about modern science, and by modern I mean like Renaissance era science, leads them to getting in trouble with the church. And once you have not just enemies of the church, but allies of the church, believers, people who are very, very much Christians, getting in trouble with the church from free inquiry, well, then you have a problem. Um, and so this is a situation of sort of implosion, where if you take the story of Adam and Eve to be literally true, to represent in some way some kind of literal truth about the origin of mankind, um, and you also take information from modern science and you synthesize them together, what you get is this just like weird nonsense that that like can't really be accepted by anyone. So an example is this theory of multiple origins of humankind. And the reason that this theory arose is because geological evidence showed a spread of humankind. Basically, geological evidence and like increasing knowledge of the globe showed that if the Garden of Eden was where we think it is, roughly somewhere in the Middle East, and people spread across all of this area in such a short period of time, how is that possible? And so one idea that was very prevalent at the time was that, well, the Garden of Eden story does not represent the origin of all humanity. It represents the origin of a group of humans. It represents the origin of Jews, and that we are all going to be, saved through them. Yada yada, the whole Christian story. This got people in trouble with the church, even though it is a good faith attempt to synthesize what the Bible says with things that are just like increasingly undeniable in the geological record. Yeah, so at this point you have this sort of self-imposed schism. That schism is not quite the right word. This self-imposed dilemma where the church and religious people feel that they need to either deny the teachings of science, or they need to conclude that they need to like abandon their religion. And I think this is a problem that we carry into the modern day. Like the church has never really resolved this contradiction in any way. They're just sort of slow rolling the way, like this event, basically. Um, and it's been pretty much left, I would say, to individuals to figure this out. And it's actually a big problem. It's a big problem for the church. And I think that I'm actually kind of surprised I don't see more religious people talking about this, because I would say it's the biggest obstacle to Christianity, like continuing to spread and get bigger, which is presumably a thing that they care about. Um, yeah, is that like many people feel, and the church has not done anything to like remove this idea from people's head. Many people feel that they can either accept modern science, or they can continue to be Christians. And you know, if you put that dilemma in front of people, it's no wonder that many of them are going to choose to not continue being Christians. So yeah, anyway, I feel like that's the book. I feel like I haven't actually talked about the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are in large part a sort of framing device for this history of Christianity. It's really interesting because I actually generally don't think that these sorts of framing devices are very successful for books. Like whenever I read a book and it says that it's about one thing, and then it turns out that that thing is a framing device for a much larger story, I'm usually like, man, this sucks. I'm reading a book that isn't about what it says it's about. But in this case, I think it really works because Stephen Greenblatt constantly ties back to the core ideas of Adam and Eve. So, in a sense, even though it's kind of a framing device for the history of Christianity, he tells the history of Christianity through the story of Adam and Eve, rather than it just being a starting point, and then he like moves on to this bigger thing that he actually wants to talk about. Like even once we're talking about Darwin, the reason that we're talking about Darwinian evolution in this book about Adam and Eve is because Darwinian evolution is often seen as the counterpoint, as the like opposition, the other story to Adam and Eve. It's seen as the word isn't quite coming to my mind, but it's seen as you either believe in evolution or you believe in Adam and Eve. So he keeps coming back to it in a way that I think is really good. One thing that's amazing is that Stephen Greenblatt, and I don't see this very often in these types of academic works, but he is a really good writer. He's a good writer, good at turning a phrase. He doesn't write in a super dense way that's hard to follow. Like I listened to this as an audiobook and it was super duper easy to, not super easy, but it was followable while I was like cooking dinner or whatever. While at the same time having intellectual heft and depth that I think is uncommon for books that are that readable. So it's unfortunate that it's uncommon for books to be both readable and entertaining and full of intellectual depth. But this is one of those books. So if you're interested in knowing more about the story of Adam and Eve or the history of Christianity, I recommend. Hold on, let me pull up the exact title. The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve by Stephen Greenblatt.